Hey everyone, welcome to the Midpoint. Making a change to our own life is already very hard. But what if included also others? Our work surrounding, for example, a group of people, or even our community? Today we'll talk about how to initiate change in any situation. And there's no one better to discuss this than Alex Budak. He dedicated his life to helping people create an impact. Now, Alex is a faculty member at UC Berkeley, a social entrepreneur, an author, and a speaker. And at UC Berkeley, Alex, among many other things, teaches his wildly popular class, Becoming a Changemaker. His book, Becoming a Changemaker, has been endorsed by Nobel Prize laureates, Olympic athletes, and most meaningfully also his former students, who now work across the globe and have an impact as changemakers every day. So let's get started and get to the show. Oh, wait a second. Have you subscribed to this podcast? If not, please do. All right, let's get started with the show. Welcome, Alex, and thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
We've been connected with each other for the longest time, and kind of it feels like the internet usually creates this picture that we know each other as friends because we've been connected for over 10 years. But this is the very first time we actually connect face to face, and it feels really awkward. We've been both part of a community called Sandbox, and it's been around for over 15 years. It connects people all over the world. And I think we never had the chance to meet in person. So it's really great to have you on board and to talk a little bit about something that is, I think, very, very often happening to most of us. We always want to create, change in life. We want to create our own habits. We want to improve ourselves. Work on ourselves, but very often a lot of the change in life also affects others, be it at work, be it with friends, be it sort of in the community or the group of people that we interact with the most. And you've been sort of a thought leader in that area to how to instill change in this type of organizations, on this type of groups and communities. And that's what we're going to talk about today. It's going to be super exciting. Tell us a little bit about sort of how you got into that topic and how you got to create that course at Berkeley as well.
Well, I've always been interested in change, but I think my perspective on change has changed quite a bit as we've gone. So, I was born and raised in the Silicon Valley in the United States. So I'm always surrounded by entrepreneurship, but I never saw myself as an entrepreneur. I saw myself as maybe entrepreneurial, but never as an entrepreneur. I was never motivated just to sell a company to Google or Facebook. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but that just motivated me. And so thinking about, well, what's a way that I could create change? Again, not really knowing exactly what it would be. I thought, well, public policy is a great route. It's a kind of intersection of politics, economics. And so I went out to Washington, D.C. to do a graduate degree there. And I think within the first 48 hours, 72 hours, I realized that I actually was pretty entrepreneurial, that I wasn't the typical public policy student. And so I never quite fit into my graduate program. I learned a lot, which is great, met amazing people, which was great, but never was that traditional public policy student. And so it took some time. Yeah.
What felt off? If you can maybe elaborate on that a little bit. So how did you realize that the others were sort of what were they focused on compared to sort of yourself?
So I noticed that they were thinking about change from the big institutions. Most of them went on to work for the World Bank or the Department of State or the IMF, the big institutions. There's a place for that type of change. And to be honest, most of them have stayed in their same career, that same organization they joined ever since we graduated in 2010. So they're a little bit more on that. And again, I'm not making a judgment, but a little more that traditional path. And I think I realized that I saw change from many different angles, that there was room for all of us to create change and maybe not just in those traditional paths. And so that motivated me to take a little time off during graduate school. And so I went and worked and lived in Ahmedabad, India, in the state of Gujarat. And so while I was there, I traveled quite a bit, but also I did a bit of work volunteering with a local organization. Now, I'm not overstating the impact I had because I did have a very small role here. But there is where I realized for the first time the potential that grassroots organizers had to create change. I was working with a group that worked with girls from the local community and used sport as a tool to teach about healthy habits and leadership. And I realized for the first time that change isn't confined to the big institutions or to the relatively few. It's for all of us. And that's really where, at that moment, my sort of, as we say in Sweden, the red thread of my career became clear, that I was going to help more people all around the world become change makers.
What is it? What is a change maker in a sentence or two, if you could summarize it?
Well, I'll start just a little bit about my evolution. So I became a social entrepreneur. And so that's kind of
Mm-hmm.
combining a lot of business and impact. And that's an amazing way to create impact and create change. But as I did it, as I met more social entrepreneurs, I realized that not all of us can nor should be social entrepreneurs. That, and I say this as one myself, we're a weird group and it's not the typical path. And so I started looking for what's a more inclusive way to think about change.
Mm-hmm.
That change isn't just about that lone founder, the one person standing up and leading a movement, but it's actually all of us. It's the CFO, it's the marketing person, it's the artist, it's the engineer. And so that's where the idea of change making became sort of front and central for me. Now, if you were to ask different people, I think there's not one single definition of change maker. But the way I define it, having worked with all these change makers around the world, is I simply say change maker is someone who leads positive change from wherever they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm deliberate in that definition that there's no mention of roles or of titles. So it's this sort of inclusive identity. And it's one we can layer on top of our existing ones. So you can be a changemaker lawyer, a changemaker doctor, or a changemaker friend, or changemaker parent. It's a way of seeing the world around you and your role in having agency to shape it.
I love that. I love the sort of the holistic view on that characteristic in a way. If what makes in that sense, what makes a change maker tick? What are the characteristics when it comes to being that, having that quality? Maybe it's a better way to express it.
Yeah, so I'm at UC Berkeley, and so maybe at this point, some of your listeners are saying, "Well, it sounds really interesting, but sounds really fuzzy here. Sounds kind of made up." And I get it, right? I live in a world of empirical data and research, and so I actually set out to try to study this. At my core, Berkeley, I'm much more of a teacher. I love teaching, and I'm not a great researcher, to be honest. That's not my specialty. But I did just a little bit of research, just to try to look at, how do people develop as change makers over time, and what are some of those traits that the most effective change makers have in common. We put together something called the Changemaker Index. By the way, if anyone wants to take it and figure out for yourself what your own changemaker strength is, you can go to changemakerbook.com/index and check it out. But
we'll put up the link for sure.
Perfect. But yeah, just some research looking at when we isolate across roles and sectors and age and experience, what are the traits the most effective changemakers have? Mm-hmm. And so what I've learned is it really falls into three buckets. That's the way I organize my class at UC Berkeley and the way I organize my book. And so the three parts are changemaker mindset, changemaker leadership, and changemaker action.
Mm-hmm. Can we dive a bit into the three? Would you help us lecture us a little bit on those three areas? That'd be great.
Yeah, so I love bringing in multiple fields into my teaching. And so with changemaker mindset, I'll pull from poetry here. So I'll pull from the words of poet Amanda Gorman. She delivered the poem "The Hill We Climb" at the inauguration of Biden and Harris here in the US. And so she says in the final three lines, "For there is always light, if we're brave enough to see it, and if we're brave enough to be it." I think this encapsulates what I mean by a changemaker mindset. For there's always light. And it's the idea that we are going through hard times right now, whether that's just you're in a company and things feel overwhelming, digital transformation and what's happening with AI, or we think about things like climate change or educational gaps or economic inequality. These are big substantive challenges that we're facing. Mm-hmm. I think changemakers are always able to see the bright light ahead. It doesn't mean that we ignore the real problems we have to solve. It doesn't say we just pretend everything's fine. But no, it's almost this agency in challenge that we're things are hard and things can be better. Tomorrow can be better than today. And I can make sure that it is. But there's always light. If only we're brave enough to see it. And here I think it's important that we often think about the term vision as being something owned by the CEO or the executive director, sort of the leader of the organization. They're the ones that have the vision.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And in my teaching, in my writing, I try to make the case that no, each of us has a role to play in that vision. So sometimes as a change maker, the vision part is recognizing a status quo that needs to be challenged, or maybe it's a system that's unjust and needs to be disrupted, but it's seeing things that others may not see quite yet, irrespective of your title. And that third part, if only we're brave enough to be it. Having worked with change makers of all types, I find that courage is central to being a change maker. It's not something that I deliberately teach in my class, but my students often remark that they developed courage along the way. And I love that because being a changemaker does take courage. It takes being willing to stand up and say, look, I don't know all the answers. Maybe I can't even solve this myself, but this is something I think is worth pursuing and I'm going to go do it. And so as we think about mindset, there's always light. There's always a better path. If only we're brave enough to see it, having that vision, recognizing opportunities where others only see problems. And if only we're brave enough to be it, that courage to take action, even and especially when it's hard.
I'd love to talk about that taking action a bit more, because I think that's whether I want to change myself or an organization where it's a multitude of people with habits and with sort of their own little silos and territories and ways and processes that they've been doing all over. I'm thinking of, let's say, a more rigid organization, maybe not a startup that doesn't even have any processes. But even then, you would have different mindsets on how things need to be run. I mean, starting with myself, taking action for myself already creates hurdles in my brain. I come up with excuses. Is there an organizational hurdle as well? How can you instill change in, or how can I? Sorry, let me reword that. Like, how can I install changes in my organization or my community?
I love that we can talk about this. I don't get to talk about this nearly enough, so let's explore it.
I think it's the most interesting part. Sorry to interrupt you again, but I love the mindset and the leadership piece. Fully agree with that. But I think the hardest part is to make sure that everybody takes action.
And that's what I hear. And working with everywhere from students to like senior executives, it's that taking action piece. It's hard for everyone. And I think that's important. We recognize that like it is hard. And like if it were easy, we would just do it all the time. So it is hard. So don't feel bad if you find it hard, because honestly, everyone does. We could start here with some research done by Jeffrey Pfeffer at Stanford University. He identified something called the knowing-doing gap. And so what he found in his research is that what holds people back is not knowing what to do. Actually, in most cases, people know what to do. Looking at companies, organizations, leadership, we often know what to do. That it's actually that fear, that knowing-doing gap. So we need to differentiate that it's often that we know the strategy. So it's not that we need to spend more time in the strategy. It's that we need to spend more time in that action piece and that culture piece. And he found that fear fosters that knowing-doing gap. So in other words, the number one thing that holds us back is fear. So we can look at that at both an individual level and an organizational level. At the organizational level, a lot of people say, hey, we need to be innovative. We want to make sure you're taking risks and trying things. But then when it comes to putting forward a new idea, are you punished for having a new idea? But then of course you would be scared. Of course, as a leader, you would say, well, why isn't my team innovating? Well, because they're scared of how it's going to happen. And so you need to think about how can we reduce that fear to try new things? Mm-hmm. And then on the individual side, so I see this so often. I developed a tool which maybe is helpful here. It's called the changemaker canvas. And what I find is that we need to move people from the strategy question to the execution question. So it's a tool, if anyone watching has used something like the business model canvas, very similar to that. But the idea here is we break it down and to make change more actionable. And so it takes, an hour or two to fill out. But if you do that hour or two of work ahead of time, then you move from a strategy question to an execution question. Then what's my first step? Who are the people I need to get involved and how do I get started from there? And so we almost like turn off that part of the brain. It's like we do that time, we set it aside, and then it's like, I just got to put that one step in front of the other.
For what kind of situations is the canvas for?
So broadly, and by the way, if anyone wants to take a look, you can take a look at changemakerbook.com/canvas. And in it, it's everywhere from like, hey, I'm someone in a company, I'm entry level, and I just want to think about a new little innovation at a big company, works at that level. But also works for the social entrepreneur, someone that's saying, I want to focus on clean water access and have a new idea. And let me think about how I can build a big movement here. So it scales really from the small to the big, micro to macro.
Yeah. And can I use it? How often can I use it? Let's say I'm more intrapreneurial. I work at a large organization. I also have a lot of ideas. Is this for me also to prepare for like a bigger meeting to present this idea? Or what's this sort of situational benefit for using the canvas? Or can I use this on a daily basis? That's more the question.
Yeah, if you have enough time, you can do it daily, I suppose. But it's more, I think maybe more a quarterly, something like that, half yearly. So it's kind of, you think about a big project. But it's great for bringing stakeholders on board too, because we often feel really overwhelmed by change. And so you try to make a pitch, but you're going from here to here to here, and you're talking about everything. And this helps focus you. And so it's everywhere from like, what's the core problem that you're solving to the why behind it. Why are you deciding to solve this out of every possible problem? But also thinking about, in more granularity, who are the people we need to get involved here? I find that oftentimes people get confused thinking, I've got to get people involved. Well, yeah, you do. But we differentiate here between, the core team, the people working on it day to day, who are the evangelists, the people who may not be active day to day. Maybe it's like a CEO or a dean or someone that gives you that sort of social proof, that first permission to get going. But then also anchoring it back. How do you know that this is actually serving the community that you want to serve? And how can you play a role in existing efforts? I think we find that sometimes change makers have the bad habit of trying to reinvent something from scratch.
Mm-hmm.
And so the canvas tries to encourage you to think, who else is working on this? And how can we plug into that existing system instead of redoing everything on our own from the beginning?
Yeah, fully agree. Especially if you want to move a big part of an organization, right? That's definitely not something you can do alone. It might prevent the individual from involving too many people because they fear that other people might claim sort of success afterwards. Like what's your viewpoint there? Should I spread the idea? Should I be afraid of it? How do I manage to make sure that everybody only looks at me once this is a success?
I think I would challenge that, actually. I think the best change makers lead with humility. And so I think it's really about, if you truly care about a change, it's about what do we make possible versus what do I make possible. There's a favorite video I like to share in my class. It's called Leadership Lessons from the Crazy Dancing Guy. Maybe some people know this. And so it's a guy that starts off at a music festival dancing by himself. Then after about 15 long seconds, another person comes and starts dancing. And then they dance together for a little bit. And then more and more people come until you get to the point where the two original people are just completely subsumed by the movement and everyone is dancing all together. And I think that's a nice...
put that video up. It's a very funny video. I remember that one. Yeah, I fully agree. Yeah. But how can you... I said that with a little bit of a smile, right? So I fully agree with the humility piece, but I think it prevents some people, right, to start that, to basically they work on it in sort of in a back room, in their basement, hypothetical basement, metaphorical basement, until the idea is ready so that nobody can claim it. At what point would you go out and sort of, or does the canvas suggest to start involving others?
So 100% sooner than you think you should. I see that all the time as well. The people love to sit on that idea, but an idea in your desk will never actually have any impact. And so there's ways we can think about, how do you actually sort of get out there with an idea? And again, there's a couple of things we can pull from social science here. There's work done by Morton Hansen and Jim Collins, an idea called fire bullets than cannonballs. And they say that before you make a big test, a big bet, right? Think you have a cannon, you've got one cannonball to shoot. Fire some bullets first to see if you're on the right path. See if some small little tests sort of help you find that bullseye. And once you found that bullseye with your small test, then boom, you go big. But I think my very favorite piece of research that's come out in the last few years was done by Italian researchers. And they were working with Italian entrepreneurs who were part of an incubator and accelerators, right? So sort of supporting their startup growth. And they had the most simple intervention. Literally all they did was they took half of the startup entrepreneurs and they taught them the scientific method. So, hypothesis testing, basically. And then they saw what happened. And they found that the entrepreneurs who had learned the scientific method were much more likely to pivot. So that's a kind of change in strategic direction. And also generated way higher revenues. And I love this because it's the most simple intervention you can imagine. But there's really powerful mental models behind it. So as a change maker, we can often fall in love with our idea, right? And so we work late nights on it. We're writing it down. We're perfecting it. We're finding the right font. And then we're redoing the deck. And then we're just never putting it out because we have to make it perfect. But the truth is that any idea you have, no matter how brilliant it is, the first time you put it out there, it's going to change. A little bit, a lot, it's going to change. The boxer Mike Tyson says, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And so with this finding, can we think more like a scientist? A scientist, she doesn't fall in love with her idea. She has a hypothesis. She thinks, I think if I do this, this will happen. And then she tests it. And if it doesn't work, does she tell herself, oh, I'm a terrible scientist? No, of course not, because she's learned something. She's realized, okay, this hypothesis didn't work. Let me go on to the next one. And so I think change makers would do well to also think of themselves as scientists, because it takes some of that pressure off of that first launch and that first potential failure.
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, when you're going out as an entrepreneur and look for funding, they recommend you to pitch to as many people as you can until you then finally pitch to the people that you actually want to invest into your startup, right? Sort of to run this by, get opinions, get rejected, do a lot of things to get, for one, better, but also to learn from all the challenges that they throw at you, and learn how you can maybe improve not just the pitch, but also the direction that you're going as a company. So taking that with an idea internally, I think totally makes sense. You should talk to as many people as you can to also get feedback, and you might run into a point where you then want to try things out, like to confirm the hypothesis, not just theoretically, but also to run certain experiments. And that usually requires funding, or usually at least it requires resources. How can I deal with that? Is this something I should just maybe start a lean approach, try to do things the way in ways that doesn't require any money, or do I need to involve my boss, or how do I go about that best inside a larger organization?
Well, you're pointing out something that's driven a lot of my career, to be honest. So I co-founded an organization called Start Some Good, that there was kind of a catch-22, that it's never easy to raise money, but it's basically you couldn't raise money until you could prove your impact. But how do you prove your impact until you have the money to launch a pilot? And we felt that there was not enough risk capital in the world, and that more people needed to take chances. We also believed, who knew better what a community needs than the community itself? And so we launched Start Some Good, which is sort of crowd-focused, community-focused fundraising. And people would use our site to where, sometimes they would raise hundreds of thousands of dollars, but also sometimes they would raise $200. And that's literally all they needed to just get started. But there were no other sources there. So this is something that I'm just deeply passionate about as an individual.
So maybe try to go on. Sorry. So you try. So maybe best way to think about this is to ask for the absolute minimum you need to get started to show. And then once you kind of have a little bit of proof and that things going to the right direction, then ask for more money. So don't ask for the world, especially also for an internal project, right? As soon as it costs $1 million, it has to go through committees, and it will be very, very slow to get approved. But start with little steps, even when it comes to resources.
Start with the simplest possible test that you can come up with. And sometimes it doesn't even need that much money. Or if it does, what's the least amount that you could get started? And know that it will be rough, but that's okay. And that's a way of building people sort of on board in the process as well. What we found with Start Some Good that was amazing is that, of course, we were a fundraising platform, but the people that used our site would say that at least as important as the funds they raised was the community that they built. Because people felt like they were part of something at the early stages. They felt like they were like buying into this. And we find that often you don't need as much money as you might think. In my class at Berkeley, students, of course, don't have a final exam, because it's how would you have a final exam in changemaking? But we do have a final project where they work together. And each group gets a bit of seed funding. They get $100 to launch a new project. And what we find is that, a lot of people would say, well, $100, that's not that much, but it's more than enough to get started. It's way more than enough. And oftentimes students don't even use that full 100. Sometimes they'll use $20. It's just knowing you have the tiny bit of capital that they know, okay, if we want to launch an event, here's money we can pay for pizzas. That helps get over some of those barriers. And so in a big company, of course, it could be different, but it's generally less than you think. And if money is the big hurdle, think about what's the smallest possible way you could test with this limited amount of resources just to get started. And as you do, bring people along the journey with you instead of just trying to prove it, make them part of the process.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I haven't thought about the community effect to it. How do you deal with the critics, the detractors, the ones that mainly also, let's say, in Switzerland and Germany, are not shy of telling you that they don't like what you're doing, and maybe they don't mean it really that way, but they just tell you their opinion. How do you deal with this group, let's say, of your audience?
Changemakers, we love to fall in love with our own ideas, right? We're thinking about it when we go to sleep. We think about it when we wake up, and we think about all the reasons this idea is right. And so we share it with the first person, and they, whether they're German or Swiss or just whatever they say, it's easy for us to feel emotionally hurt by that. But I go back to the words of UC Berkeley Haas's former dean, Rich Lyons. He says, we've got to see resistance as rational. That when people push back on something, that's rational for them, right? They're not hating you. They're not hating your idea. It's rational. There's classic behavioral economic research about the status quo bias, Samuelson and Zeckhauser, which shows that the status quo bias is real. People tend to like what we already have. even when the alternative is better, we tend to sort of overvalue that already. So let's see that, if someone pushes back, it's not there's something wrong with them. It's that they're actually being quite rational. But there's a framework here that I really like. This is done by the group Nobel. That's Nobl. And they talk about the 3 types of people you meet while leading change. So the 3 types of people you meet are the champions, the fence sitters, and the cynics. So we'll get to the cynics in a second. But the champions, these are people who are excited about what you're doing, your early supporters, and say with them, delegate to them early and often, get them involved, make them feel part of it, give them roles. The fence sitters, these are people that could kind of go either way. They say changemakers tend to spend too much time focused on them. They say, forget about the fence sitters for a second. They'll come around. There's enough momentum. Like we saw in that crazy dancing guy video. Once half the group was dancing, then everyone was dancing, right? So leave the fence sitters alone. And now let's come to the cynics. And they define cynics in, I think, a really refreshing way. They say that often a cynic is just a disappointed idealist. When I read that changed my perspective on what it meant to be a cynic. So maybe there's someone who actually believes in change, but they've seen change come and go 3 times at the company, and it's never worked. Maybe they so deeply want to believe in this change, but they just don't think it's possible. And that makes them feel that much more emotionally charged when
they would have an opinion about it. Yeah, true. Yeah.
Yeah. It's something I experienced myself in the early days of Start Some Good. So our team was myself and my co-founder and 2 very part-time coders, buddies of mine from university. And we were going up against big sites like Kickstarter or Indiegogo. And so I was technically in charge of the tech team, even though I shouldn't have been, but I was kind of overseeing it. And I'd get these emails from users, and I would honestly be shocked by the emotion and vitriol they put into their complaints about the site. They talk about a missing function or something that happened that went wrong. And of course, my first reaction is to be really defensive. Be like, don't you understand? Like, Kickstarter is venture backed. They've got 100 engineers. I have 2 part-time engineers. We're doing our very best. Like, just give us a chance. But when I thought about it through that lens, I thought, well, how amazing is it actually that this person who used our site cares enough that they're going to write me this 2-page email all about a button that they want on our site? That's actually pretty amazing. They're actually really invested in the change. It's coming through in an awkward way, perhaps, but they really care. And so with that cognitive switch, I started bringing them in to be part of the change. I thank them for their feedback. Once we were ready to maybe beta test a new feature, I'd give them early access to it. And many of these early cynics became some of our greatest champions because they felt heard and because I wasn't as defensive with them, because I saw in them that maybe they actually believed in us much more than I thought. They just wanted to be heard and have their perspective valued.
That reminds me of actually a very own example, working with a large enterprise for an American company, but the client was actually a European sort of group of people. And as soon as they started working with us, they came with a list of complaints of things that were not going right in their point of view. And my American colleagues characterized them as, the worst client because they're complaining so much. And I had to tell them, like, no. They really are invested in this now. They want to make us together, the partnership better. Don't see this as a complaint. See this as constructive suggestions to the roadmap and to the way we can do work better together. Just remind me the way you just described it with your users. I've seen many people turn from, let's say, an distant critic to the biggest maybe champion, or sort of switching maybe also labels, right? The biggest advocate, and suddenly they're not critical anymore. Suddenly they tell the whole world how great things are. So you're basically saying invest most of the time in enable the champions so that they can invest their time, and then spend your time more on the critics rather than on the fencers, you said? Or what do you call them?
Fence sitters, yeah, exactly.
Fence-sitters, sorry. Okay. Cool. This is such a great topic. I feel like from a action-taking side of things, every situation is different. It's very tough to bucket it all into one conversation. But your book is super interesting. I'm almost done with it. I almost made it to the finish line before we had a chance to chat. But maybe just tell me a bit about sort of yourself and the movement you created. Because of what I see on social media, what I see on LinkedIn, everybody's talking about changemaker. Everybody's talking about your course. Can you tell me a little bit about what kind of community you've created just with the course and the book itself?
Well, I mean, that's been the best part of this. And really, as we talked about this idea of like, it shouldn't be about me. So this community is not about me. It's about the students and about the folks that are part of it. And throughout writing this book, I've wanted to just create a platform where we can elevate the stories and the examples of other change makers that inspire me. And that's really what we do. But it's been amazing to see at Berkeley that so many students have rallied around this idea of change making. I think you talked at the beginning about how a lot of identities maybe aren't so inclusive, that like entrepreneur is not that inclusive, or venture capitalist is not that inclusive, innovator is not that inclusive. But that people are seeing something in the idea of being a change maker that's more inclusive. It's this community. And in my teaching and my writing, I try to bring that really inclusive lens where we see that each of us have a role to play and we can support each other. One of the things that's been very cool is I've been teaching now since 2019. Mm-hmm. And so when students finish the class, they become part of our class alumni group. And it's been wonderful to see the way that these people now support each other, right? So now a few years out, we have plenty of people who are out in the working world. They're doing things and they're continuing to support folks who are maybe 2021 just learning these things. And that's a good example, I think, of the champions, that my job here is not to make everything central to me, but to sort of put some ideas out there, help generate a community, and then get out of the way and let them do really cool things. And that's what I try to be conscious of.
Are they part of Berkeley alumni, or do you also have sort of are they aware of who is a changemaker alumni?
Yeah, we've got like a separate like changemaker alumni group. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's like them specifically because everyone's sort of been through this experience together, and I think that unites them.
That's very cool. Maybe more personal question. What kind of change are you sort of making yourself in the coming months? So sort of have you planned at Berkeley? Is there anything that where you've written a canvas about for the next couple of quarters?
Well, change is so personal, and so I think I'll actually talk on the personal lens as well. So I'm a dad, and that's my favorite out of all the identities. Dad is my favorite. And my little guy used to be such a good sleeper, and now he's such a bad sleeper. And so it used to be he would sleep in the morning until 7:30 or 8, and now he's often getting up in the 5s. And so for a guy like me, who I do my best and most creative work late at night, when I was doing Start Some Good, when I had sort of no obligations, no family obligations, I would work until 2, 3 a.m. And that's like where I did my most creative work. And needless to say, that does not work. My little toddler does not care about my sleep schedule. Exactly. And so I think some of them working on a bit is like to be a bit more morning person. That's still more of a challenge, but just to like get to sleep a little bit earlier, to stop using those late night hours is my sort of most productive time, and find ways I can be more productive earlier in the day. And so I can't say that it's going super well. I find it very hard, but that's my change.
But did you present the canvas to your little one, and did he understand what you're trying to do?
I would say he's a cynic. Yeah.
You can win him over, I'm sure. Oh, wonderful. Yeah, thank you so much for being available, having this conversation. It was super interesting. I can recommend everybody to read the book Changemaker, or Becoming a Changemaker, from Alex Budak. We're gonna put up tons of links. Thanks for sharing those, all the index, the canvas, but I also will put up the video to the guy who starts dancing at the festival. It's brilliant. It's one of my favorite videos. And we will close up with a quick ask for everybody. Please, if you like the show today, please subscribe to the podcast and also leave us a positive review. We're gonna put all the links in the show notes, and we'll see you again next Friday for our next episode. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Alex, for joining us.